Hello all and good day. I hope you had a great weekend and that you are ready to go for this next week. We have another low-key week of lecture, and for this week we will just be reviewing one chapter. This gives you plenty of time to catch up with your other classes and to prepare for the quiz that's this Friday and then your upcoming exam, which is in a few weeks. This week you will still have your assignment due on Friday through the Dropbox on D2L, but please note that you also have a quiz that will be available for you on Friday. It will be available all day just like the last exam and quiz, and this will be over not this week, but the previous two lectures. Please note that exam 3 will be rescheduled. There is a date that we do have for this on the syllabus, but this exam will end up being a few weeks earlier. The exact dates are being figured out, but please stay tuned and just note that exam 3 will be on a different date than what you currently have. And then also please note that exam 2 is coming up. It's still a few weeks out, but it is ahead of you. So please make sure that you have that scheduled on your calendar. This week we will be discussing pastries, which is the topic of chapter 19 in your textbooks. We have talked about food preparation properties related to pastries in previous chapters. Remember the roles of the structure-related ingredients, and remember cutting in. Cutting in is a concept related to promoting flakiness in certain baked foods, and flakiness is going to be an essential concept for pastries. There is a simple definition of a pastry. Knowing this definition will help you understand the ideal characteristics of a pastry, which may actually be different than what you expect. There is a large amount of fat that is included in the pastry, and many times because of this, pastries are at risk for crumbling. This is because they hold foods with a very high water content. Creating the right texture can involve very careful mixing and rolling methods, as well as a careful addition of the ingredients into a pastry. Know what these techniques are, and know what can happen if these techniques are not followed appropriately. We will talk a little bit more about health considerations of a pastry, but regardless of how you cut it, pastries are foods that should be consumed in moderation. Because we have talked about moderation in previous chapters, we will quickly run through this concept and only highlight the main points, but know the key messages related to moderation because this information may be on your quiz and it will certainly be on your next exam. When I used to hear the word pastry, I would think of a puffed up sweet food that tasted like a pie. The basic definition of a pastry is actually much simpler than this. A pastry by itself does not have a significant amount of sugar in it. Pastries are simply a mixture of dough with fat that has some degree of flakiness. While there are many types of sweet pastries, there are also many types of non-sweet pastries that carry high protein foods, and these will leave a taste that is not sweet. Also, there are pastries that do not have a puffy dough. Many pastries have a more dense consistency. So, pastry does not mean sweet, and it does not mean puffy necessarily. The next slide will explain this in greater detail and outline instances in which we can have different types of pastries. The book lists 3 different classifications of pastries, but pastries can be really broken down into 2 main categories. And the difference between these two is mainly that one is puffy and the other is relatively flat. A puff pastry is the puffy one of the two. The puff pastry uses a large amount of butter that is applied with great care to ensure a high level of flakiness and expansion of the dough. The dough is very light and fluffy, but it is still very tender. It requires more care with regards to preparation, largely related to unique methods of adding butter to the pastry. The plain pastry, on the other hand, does not rise and is much more condensed. It is very easy to create because the mixing methods for plain pastry are much simpler and do not require a unique addition of butter to create an optimal level of flakiness and puffiness. The book lists 2 different types of plain pastry, one that carries a high protein food and one that is a crust for a tart, turnover, or pie. Both of these pastries are the exact same structure. They're both very flat. A good example of the protein-carrying pastry is a quiche, which will comprise a product that has a much more savory flavor. Pot pies are other examples of foods that use this type of pastry. The crust for a tart, turnover, or a pie has the same composition as a pastry that carries a high protein food, but the flavor of the entire product will be much sweeter, and again, the flavor of the pastry by itself will be the same between types 1 and 2 of the plain pastry. There are 4 essential ingredients in a pastry, and these are flour, water, fat, and salt. Now you may be thinking that there are a few ingredients missing if we have, say, an apple pie or a pumpkin pie. For both of those, the pastry is going to be just the crust. So the pumpkin pie is just going to include the bottom crust. The apple pie is going to have just the bottom crust as the pastry, and the top doughy layer is also going to be the pastry. But the filling, the apple pie mix or the pumpkin pie mix, those are completely different things. Those are not pastries themselves. The pastry just applies to the doughy structure, and that's why it's just these 4 ingredients that are used to create that doughy structure. The first of those ingredients is flour, and for flour we can use all-purpose or pastry flour, and the flour is designed to provide structure. Now the all-purpose flour, this is going to create a relatively tough structure because it has more protein in it. The pastry flour creates a structure that is more so designed to promote a more tender dough. Water helps gluten to form. Now just enough water should be used to barely form a dough, because if we add too much water, too much gluten is going to develop. It's going to cause that pastry to have a very tough structure, and as a result, we're not going to get the tenderness that we want from that pastry. So fat, this is going to do 2 things. It produces the tenderness by coating the strands of gluten, and then also creates flakiness. Fat is going to trap air between the layers of the pastry, and then when it is heated, these layers are going to produce steam, and the steam creates pressure that helps to separate the pastry. Now if we're using an all-purpose flour, the amount of fat should be increased. And this is because the all-purpose flour is going to be a bit tougher, and we need more fat to promote more tenderness in that final product. And then of course we add salt. And the addition of salt to a pastry has much more to do with its structure than it does with taste, because we really won't be able to taste the salt in the pastry. It does not have a significant impact on the flavor of a food. And this is largely related to its interactions with gluten and water, but just know that salt is going to help with the structure to make sure that it's a very strong structure for that pastry. For pastries, the main thing that we're trying to do when we're mixing them is to create the right amount of flakiness. And so for this, there's 4 different methods that you can go about mixing the pastry dough, but we're just going to focus on 3 of them: the traditional mixing method, the hot water and oil method, and then the puff pastry method. So for the traditional mixing method, which you will use in the vast majority of cases when you're preparing a pastry, you're going to cut the fat into pea-size particles and mix this in with the flour. There's going to be a minimal amount of mixing so that you do not overdevelop the gluten. You're going to create a dough ball, which is going to be refrigerated for 15 to 30 minutes, and during this refrigeration period, water is moving throughout the dough and the fat is chilled. And so the fat is chilled so that it's going to be very solid before it's heated, so you're going to have that optimal level of flakiness. And then from there it's rolled into the crust, you add the filling, and then it's baked. For the hot water and oil method, you're going to usually do this with butter, and you're going to add butter with the boiling water. And so you're not going to get the same level of flakiness in the pastry because it's not going to be that solid fat when it's cooked. Even if it does warm up a bit, it's still not going to be that same structure that you're going to get with a solid little piece of fat that's going to create a very high level of flakiness. So this will be used when you're looking to spend less time and energy on the cutting in process. It's very simple, but again, it's not going to produce quite as much flakiness. The puff pastry method, this is designed to maximize the amount of flakiness that's in a pastry. So there's going to be cutting in that's done originally, but you're going to take out a small amount of the fat and flour mixture that you have already cut in, and then the rest of that dough is going to have water that's mixed with it. And so this dough is mixed and it's rolled out. So you already have cut in fat to this large dough structure, so you're going to have a flaky consistency, but on top of this rolled out dough, you're going to add that small amount of fat and flour mixture that has not been mixed with water yet, and you're going to sprinkle that on top of the formed dough. And so then you re-roll the dough, and with that you're going to have more air pockets on the inside that will create more flakiness in that final product. The plain pastries, to create the final structure, which is a carrying agent for either some type of sweet food or a high protein food, it has to be rolled. So after the dough of a plain pastry is mixed, it must be rolled to create the final structure required for the pastry. Letting the dough sit for a few minutes after mixing allows better gluten development, which is going to help the dough become more elastic and more easily stretched, and therefore rolled and formed to a more ideal structure. If the area that you are cooking in is very warm, and you're using butter or solid fat, which you most commonly will, the butter or the solid fat in the dough could melt too early, and this would make its structure much more similar to that of a dough that's mixed with an oil, and this is not going to produce an optimal tenderness and flakiness for a pastry. So if the area that you work in is very warm, chill the dough before it is rolled so that the butter remains in a solid form. Be careful not to put too much flour on the rolling surface. Too much flour is going to add extra flour to the pastry, which is negatively going to affect the structure of that final product. And while gluten development is a goal of mixing and rolling, too much rolling will create an excessive amount of gluten, which can toughen the pastry and cause the pastry portion of the food to shrink during the baking process. For plain pastries, you do not want too many air pockets because these air pockets will let steam into the pastry and cause expansion and fluffiness of that dough. Now this is very good for puff pastries, but it is not going to create a tight, condensed structure that is required for plain pastries. And finally, prick the dough with a fork. This is a process also known as docking. This will help to ensure that there are no major air bubbles left in the dough, which again would create too much steam and then cause those air pockets to expand and create a lighter, less condensed structure. A plain pastry should be thick and not puffy like a puff pastry. Large air pockets will promote expansion, which would not create a desirable structure for a pie crust or for any food that comes from a plain pastry. To prevent large air pockets, prick the sheet of dough or poke small holes into its structure, and this will ensure that any air pockets that may have been created in that pastry are broken up and that the air is released from those pockets. Most pastries have crusts that are baked before the filling is added, but if a pastry is baked with a filling, in the case of apple or pumpkin pie, there is special attention that must be applied. This is to ensure that the filling is cooked fully before the crust becomes too brown. If the filling is not adequately cooked before the crust is too brown, the filling is going to soak the crust, which causes the crust to fall apart and become very crumbly. We will look at this in a little greater detail in 2 slides. The main goal of preparing a pastry is to achieve the right level of flakiness and tenderness. The flakiness is defined by thin layers of dough that are separated by very small open spaces, and they're very visible in a well-cooked pastry. Now this flakiness occurs by fat being cut into a pastry dough, which is going to create space between the layers, which is manifested by pockets of air. Solid fats will not melt until the baking process begins, so even if they're evenly distributed throughout the entire product, they're not going to be as well mixed as the oil. And this is actually a good thing, because this space between the little pieces of solid fat is what helps to create those very small air pockets. Those air pockets, when heated, are going to produce steam, and that steam is what causes the separation of the pastry dough and gives it that final level of flakiness. Oil again mixes completely with the dough, and it cannot be separated as well as the little pieces of solid fat. Pastry tenderness is also related to the inclusion of fat. By coating the gluten, fat is going to prevent as much gluten development from occurring. Gluten development creates a tougher structure of the food that it's baked with. Now, if we have some fat, we're going to prevent all that gluten from forming, and we don't want to do too much fat, because too much fat means that not enough gluten would form and the structure would simply collapse and fall apart. But if we use the right amount of fat, just enough gluten development will occur to keep that food stable, but also prevent too much gluten development from occurring, so that it's not a very tough structure and it regains a lot of that tenderness. A number of things can go wrong with pastries, as with any baked food. If you add too much salt, the structure can be too tough and lack tenderness. Too little salt will produce a pastry that does not stick together, and it may be excessively crumbly. Many of the problems with pastries, however, are related to incorporation of fat into the final product, especially with the popover pastries, because they contain a high amount of fat, and because the fat has to be added in the correct amounts at the correct times. Some of the more common problems are related to the temperature of the butter. To allow butter to be appropriately distributed, which is very essential to getting the optimal level of flakiness, it should be chilled when it is mixed in or cut into the dough. The butter, if it's too warm or for its room temperature beforehand, it will melt and it will be more like oil, which is not going to create the ideal level of flakiness in that dough. Too much water is going to promote more gluten development. Remember, we just want enough water to barely form that dough, and too much gluten development is going to decrease tenderness. Too little water is going to create a dry dough that is excessively crumbly, because the gluten strands have not effectively developed with one another. Now, too much fat is a problem as well. It's really easy to get excited when we hear that pastries need plenty of butter to create an ideal structure, but it is possible to get too much butter in a pastry. By coating the gluten strands, which helps to create better tenderness, gluten strands do not bind as well together. So that's good to some degree, but too much fat will prevent gluten from developing to the extent that it needs to, just to form a stable structure. So if it is excessively tender, the pastry will crumble and not stick together. The final problem is soaked crusts, and this happens with many pies that have a high juice or water content. The juice or the water is going to reach the crust and soak it, making it overly tender and more likely to fall apart when it is finished cooking. To prevent soaking in fruit pies, you can coat the upper surface of the pie with butter and use a very hot oven temperature for the first 15 minutes of baking. And this is going to help create a more stable dough structure. Also, you can add a thickening agent to the pie filling that is going to provide a better consistency that's going to be less likely to cause soaking. Now for custard and pumpkin pies, adding eggs to the dough is going to cause coagulation and thickening of the pie crust during baking, which is a good thing. Because lower temperatures promote a quicker coagulation time, chilling the pastry for 1 hour before adding the filling and then using higher temperatures very early on in the cooking will help to create a more stable structure more quickly. Regardless of how you dice it, pastries are not really nutrient-dense food options. Butter and flour are not necessarily bad ingredients, but because they are used in very large quantities, they become somewhat of a health risk with these foods. Now you can replace the flour that is used with whole wheat flour, but remember, whole wheat flour is going to contain more protein, which will contribute to a tougher structure for that pastry. A good middle ground would be to take the total flour needed and divide it in half between whole wheat and refined or pastry flour. This would increase the nutritional value of the food without risking a compromise in its structure. If you do not mind a tougher texture, then use all whole wheat. But do not be fooled, it would not be a huge improvement in nutrient quality, but at the same time, any improvement to the nutrient quality of a food is still going to be an improvement. The best recommendation for pastries is to eat them in moderation. Now we talked a little bit about moderation in the previous chapters, but having 1 to 2 small servings a day of foods that might have more sugar, more fat, more refined flours is actually okay, and it may even have some health benefits, but it's important that with that we're getting good balanced meals throughout the course of the day that are filled with nutrient dense foods.